Life has been very interesting for us. We have had the privilege, my wife and I, to live in different countries, in India, in Costa Rica, in Ecuador, and in Chile. And my wife lived for a year in the Philippines. And it's interesting where the Lord has taken us on our journey, and it's interesting from where we've begun and where we are now. And it's been quite a radical shift from where we started. I'm the son of a truck driver. My father owns a trucking firm out of Regina. Actually, something very interesting that I didn't realize until this morning. My father's firm that he built up, he started from one truck many years ago. For 20 years, I did all the shipping for the Case International Missionary Company for all of Saskatchewan and Alberta and parts of Manitoba. And his company, people came into Portage la Prairie here as well. I am a very average, normal person. After high school and just before high school was finished, I packed groceries for the Dominion grocery store, which is now called Safeways. And I love the Lord. I'm a very average, normal person. The only thing that isn't too average right now is the profile, and it's a little bit bigger than most. But the Lord has looked after me in very special ways. And I want to share with you this morning, in a very personal way, what he did for us. It is now 5 years ago when we were living in the port city of Guayaquil in Ecuador, a city of 2.3 million that's on the coast, that's on the equator. It's a place that's actually rather a dangerous place because it averages over 40 murders a day there. And in every day's paper, you will see in the next morning a picture of all the people, the bodies that they've managed to catch up and locate in the morning paper, and you will see how they died, and it's rather graphic. It's a place where your children are not allowed to walk to school because fair-skinned children from North America command quite a premium on the black market. My oldest son is Tim. He's now 14. He's bright red hair. I have Tom with light brown hair, Sherry with lighter brown hair still, and Danny that's a blondie. And on the black market in the city of Guayaquil, they are worth between $15,000 and $20,000 US. And so they have to walk with you when you are walking anywhere. We lived in a house that has bars on the window and bars on the door. And on the gate, which is a high gate, you have lots of smashed glass. It's embedded in the cement so people can't get over it. This city there, the people get around a lot with public transport. But if you do, in fact, have a car, you have to be very careful. Because especially in the evening or the night, the last thing you would want to do is stop at a stop sign. Because people are ready and waiting to block you in with another vehicle that you can't get anywhere and smash your window open and pull you out of your car. The center of downtown is an interesting place. It's a great big hill where they have radio transmission towers. Around the base of that hill, there's a cemetery, and it's rather ironic. But you have one road that goes over that hill, and you take it at your own risk, because as you are driving, it narrows down into one lane or passageway. And the police there do, in fact, not go on this road because it is that dangerous. What they have near the top are great big metal poles filled with cement on either side of the road. And if there are people watching, what they do is that they will throw big chains in front of your cars and hook them to these metal and cement-filled posts on either side, and they'll do the same thing behind you. And when that happens, you've had it. And you might become one of these statistics of the 40 people that are murdered every day. The Ecuadorian government does not like to publicize that factor because it makes New York look a little bit like Romper Room or Mr. Dress Up. And the murder rate is increasing at 30% a year. And another problem with the murder rate is that they figure that anywhere to 20 to 30 more people die a day, but they do not get the statistics on those people because, in fact, the police themselves are doing it. The police are very corrupt there. But getting back to this hill in the center of Guayaquil called Cerro, if they like what they see, and there aren't any other oncoming cars that are close by that would alert the authorities to the problem, they would put chains in front of your vehicle and chains behind. They'd whip you out of the car. And what they first would do would knock you out, and then they would take all your clothing off. It's a very poor country, and they don't want to wreck the clothing. And then they'd stab you, and they have a very convenient disposal unit for bodies there. This city, Guayaquil, is a big port city. It's 40 miles inland from the ocean, but there are two small rivers, the Daule and the Baba Oyo, that join together just above the city, and they form one big river, the Waias River, and that's a river that at that point is deep enough for the big ocean-going boats to come in on, and they come to this big port city. How they dispose of the bodies, at 4 o'clock there's a tide that goes out, and there's lots of what they call esteros, or little estuaries, and they dump the bodies in there without clothing, so you can't identify them right away, and they float out down the river at the 4 o'clock on the outgoing tide. It's a city where for 6 months of the year, the average summer temperature is anywhere from 105 to 125 Fahrenheit, and it's very humid, and sometimes the humidity is 100%. You cannot go down there and eat the food without soaking it in bleach or in iodine. And that's to kill all the organisms and the microbes that are in there that really have affected the food system. In order to drink the water, what you do, even though it's hot and it's really humid and muggy, you would get a great big container and put it on the stove, and you would heat it up and boil it for about 25 minutes. So it's a unique place. It's a place when you're walking downtown at night, you want to be very, very careful, because if you walk too close to the edge of the sidewalk in the evening in downtown, there are small little black cars, taxis, that are cruising around the center of the city looking for people like you. And it's a very foolish thing to do, to be by yourself downtown at that point, because if you're too close to the sidewalk, all of a sudden a car will come blazing up and it'll slam on its brakes, and what they do is they'll whip open a door, and it's all timed perfectly, and when they whip open the door, it's when you're standing there, and all of a sudden, wham, it knocks the breath right out of you, and you're stunned. Then they'll pull you into the car and bop you over the head. Then the other procedure takes place, and they'll get your clothes and whatever money, and then they get rid of your body the same way. I'm not sensationalizing it. This is just the way it is. You would also have to be very careful when you're walking downtown, because there are a lot of people, if you're walking close to the walls of the houses, that they're watching through little peepholes. And if you're walking too close to the door, what they do is they have a relay system of people in different places that are watching, and they can communicate that behind the walls. And you'll be walking along, and all of a sudden, wham, the door will fly open in your face, and it'll knock the breath right out of you. And of course, they take you on the inside and knock you out, and then get your clothes, and then kill you and throw you in one of the estuaries as well. It's quite a place. It's where in the last year, the Peruvians and the Ecuadorians are fighting on the border. And it's also a place where cholera has really attacked the food system, and a lot of people have died. It's quite a city. It's quite dirty. The phones don't work between 9 to 5. And if you sometimes can occasionally get through, every so often you might have 10 or 15 or 20 other sets of phone calls all of a sudden break through. And then you'll have a big laugh together, and you hang up and you try again. It's also a place where people need and love the Lord. And we have over 50 churches, Alliance churches, in that port city of Guayaquil. And those people are the most beautiful, gracious people you could ever lay eyes on. And if that's where the Lord wants you, it's the most incredible, wonderful place to be. And we love being there. You just had to make a few adjustments. It's somewhat different than Regina. And we do have another problem. We lived in an area near the airport, and where these rivers came together to form the navigable river, and there are a lot of smuggling of drugs going on. And because of the Colombians and the United States people cracking down on the drug runners, you have these people also coming in as well. And every night as we went to bed, we would hear between 10 and 15 gunshots. And Regina never was like that. All of a sudden, 5 years ago, we had a major problem. We had an election, and there you have about 30 parties running, and you have posters plastered everything on the walls, on the gates, and everywhere. They don't ask your permission. You don't like the poster, you go get another one. I've seen posters plastered on walls till they're that thick. And then after that election is over, because the vote is so splintered, they'll have a runoff election between the top two candidates. And we were in that process in Ecuador 5 years ago, when all of a sudden something very weird happened. The party representing the current president, which was very far right, and the one party that was very communist and very ultra-left party, they were the ones that got the top two votes. And it was interesting what happened. And it looked like it would be just a runaway victory for the current political party that represented the outgoing president. But just before the second election, there was a big scandal in government, And all of a sudden, people were very upset with that party. Come election day, what happened? The second party that only had 5.8% of the initial popular vote was the party that was elected to form the next government. And all of a sudden, we went from having an ultra-rightist president to one that was taking office that was ultra-leftist. And all of a sudden, there was turmoil in the country, and all of a sudden, we started having lots of riots. And down there, riots are like here going to a football game. They're very popular, and all you do is you get a whole bunch of old tires, you get pop bottles, you put a wick in and gasoline, and you make Molotov cocktails, and you power the tires high, and you soak them with gas, and then you block all the traffic, and away you go, and you can have yourself a nice little demonstration. And that's very common down there. Oftentimes, I've been in situations, all of a sudden, you've come up on gas lacrimogena. That's tear gas, and it's an awful smelly thing. And all of a sudden, after this big scandal in government and this far leftist fellow being elected, all of a sudden, there was rioting taking place all over the country, and people were very unsettled. And all of a sudden, there was such turmoil that it looked like the military leaders would do, which they often do in South America, that they would stage a coup and take everything into their own hands. We had a particular problem because the Air Force General, not only did he not like what was going on with this new president-elect, this ultra-leftist, but he also didn't like the head general that was the head of the army. And they had an intense like of each other and a common distrust and dislike of the new president. And all of a sudden, there was rioting almost every day. And not only being a part of the mission, but I was a representative from the mission to the embassies. All of a sudden, they started talking to us in terms of, it looks like this country is headed for turmoil, the possibility of a coup, and you need to be ready to evacuate. And we were making contingency plans. It got so bad as what was happening next door in the country of Peru, the mission started instituting a series of code words. And if you had code words that made no sense to the people, the Spanish people there, but those code words that had pre-established meanings for us, that meant that it was time to get to the airport as quick as you could, and it was time to get out, because it was that dangerous. And we lived in danger constantly, but it seemed to be deteriorating the situation and getting that much worse. And all of a sudden, we would see a couple of times in Guayaquil a Canadian Air Force's jet from Trenton Air Force Base in Ontario, and they were doing practice runs into the Guayaquil airport. And they were practicing for the day that they would have to take out the nationals. We lived in the port city of Guayaquil, and we were wondering, is this it? Is it going to be time to leave? When all of a sudden the situation started getting so bad, the Air Force General with his French Mirage jets decided to buzz the capital city of Quito, which is in the mountains at the 10,000 foot level, and the port city of Guayaquil, 2.3 million people, right on the coast at sea level. What he'd do, especially in Quito, where it even made more of an impact because that's where the seat of government is, that city is 40 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide. It's in a steep mountain valley, and one side there's a great big volcano. Right at the end of the southernmost tip, there's another mountain. It's just a regular mountain. It's not a volcano. And then there's a low-lying ridge, and there's a steep drop-off that you have to go down about 4,000 feet into a valley floor. And what he would do with his French Mirage jets, he would go down the middle of the city, about 5, 8, 10, 15 of them sometimes. And there's a park that runs about 5 kilometers in the middle of the city called Parque Carolinas, and these jets would come in and they would buzz the city at about the 6th or 7th floor level. And when you have jets at the 6th or 7th floor level, and you have a 10 or a dozen or 15, it makes quite a statement, besides making a lot of noise. And that's where the airport is, and when you go at that low of a speed, all of a sudden, or low of an altitude, all of a sudden you have to put on a lot of speed and start climbing an angle to the right, because if you don't do that, you run smack dab into another mountain. And some airliners have done that. That's one of the most dangerous airports in the world. And what these Air Force jets would do, they would climb and go to the right, and then all of a sudden they would go into afterburner and make sonic booms. And that absolutely terrorized the population. That didn't bother the Army Air Force, or the Army General rather, because a typical Latin, he will not back down. There's lots of machismo. All he'd do was take his tanks and he would park them at the end of the runway where the airplanes were taking off from, because sometime or other they'd have to come down for diesel or for aviation fuel. And that was the kind of environment that we were living in. And all of a sudden we had to sometimes keep stores of food in our home for the eventuality that we might have to stay indoors for 2, 3, or 4 days. And we had to keep reserves there, because when people are rioting, the last thing you want to do, It looked like an American in Ecuador. And bless the Americans' hearts, they pay a penalty for being the most powerful nation on earth. And a lot of these leftist people and the communist agitators, when they would see an American, would often try and torch their car and beat them up. And so they would tell us that you would have to stay home for those days and keep a supply of food and water on hand. All of a sudden, the rioting got worse and worse, and all of a sudden we couldn't go anywhere, and we were in constant contact with the mission headquarters in the capital city of Guayaquil by telephone early in the morning. And they were saying to us, we've got real problems here, and it looks like it might be it that we might have to leave at any moment's notice. And it was getting pretty dangerous. And all of a sudden we couldn't go anywhere, and there was a week when the smoke that was over the city of Guayaquil was like a funeral pyre. It was just like what we saw in India when they burned bodies after cremation. There was black smoke hanging like a cloud over the city. And to top it all off, that came from the burning of tires because of demonstrations. Then also you would have this mixture of a smell of tear gas. And what would happen with the demonstrators, and the university was closed down, there'd be pitched battles with the police. And down there, your homes and the businesses downtown all have a certain type of a folding metal. It's like a bifold door, but instead of going on the vertical, it's on the horizontal. And when they see any sign of trouble, the merchants or the owners of banks and stores downtown, all of a sudden they'll see that and they'll go outside and they'll start unwinding these things, and they'll cover the doors and they'll cover the display windows of the shops. And in just a couple of moments, it all of a sudden looks like a fortress and you can't see anything. And people will go racing away to try and get out of the people that are throwing rocks and the people that are shooting guns and the Molotov cocktails and the burning tires. And people get used to that. But all of a sudden they were burning buses and they were torching cars. And all of a sudden we had to stay home, and the smell was lousy and the sounds were even worse. And even though we were sort of used to that kind of environment, it somehow got away worse than that. And in the Quito is where the Alliance Academy, where the Alliance Mission has a school just like you have here, and it services missionary children from all over South America, and there are 500 or 600 students there. And when all of a sudden this problem was taking place and it looked like we were going to have to evacuate, you can imagine the pressure on the people in the Alliance leadership with all these 600 children there in this kind of environment. And so they closed school down a little bit early, and they sent all the children home. And that was the time of year it was. It was in May. But you know what? The only children that were on hand still at the school were children of those of us who lived and worked in different places in Ecuador. And we just couldn't go up there to the capital city and get them because you couldn't drive and it was too dangerous. And all of a sudden we came to this week, and we were full of tension because we thought, here we are, my wife Bev and the 3 youngest children, but our oldest son, who was 8 at the time, was up in Quito. And they kept phoning us, you've got to get up here and get him. Because if they have to evacuate and you have lots of children on hand and you have to go to the airport and you have just a few people that are looking after lots of children, it's very dangerous. And there's a lot of opportunists that hang around the airport. And if they saw one of these children that are worth, they don't see them as children, they see them as if they were a $15,000 or $20,000 bill. That wouldn't bother them all to try and snatch them and kidnap them. So here we were, and it was time to go to Quito, and we wondered, what do we do? And for 5 days we couldn't go anywhere. And the rioting went on day after day, and the buses closed down, the airport closed down, the post office closed down, the banks closed down, all the places where you could buy food closed down. And it was pitched battle, and it was a city where everything was out of control. And the police were trying to regain control, but it was futile. And at night, lots of buildings were burning, and we wondered, what do we do? And people back home were praying for God's protection. And I fully believe in that. But you know, all of a sudden, one morning, after 5 days of solid rioting and burning buses and torching businesses and everything being shut down, all of a sudden, it was quiet. We woke up one morning, and we looked, and there wasn't as much black smoke in the sky. And we thought, hey, this thing has finally wound down this time. Maybe we can make a break, and we can drive the 250 miles to Quito and go get our son Tim. And so I phoned Quito, and they said, yes, by all means, get out of there if you can get out of there, and come get your son. And then I went out to the checkpoints, and there the police have checkpoints every 5 or 6 kilometers in Ecuador. And I went out to the first checkpoint, and I said, what are the highways like? Are they open? Are they free? And the colonel that was in charge of the checkpoint outside of Guayaquil says it looks like they are. Now that isn't necessarily a good thing, but because at those checkpoints in Ecuador, those police are not only there to help you, they're there to try and get money out of you. And every 5 or 6 kilometers, they're looking for a donation. That's not the kind of donation you want to make. I never made one in the 4 years that I was there. But it wasn't for their lack of trying. So my wife and my 3 children, the youngest ones, we piled into the Ford Aerostar that was given to us by family and friends to work down there in the mission. And we also took a national gal and her 8-month-old baby son, and away we went. And we started driving out of the city, and you can't believe what it felt like to get out of this smell. And all of a sudden, we realized we were in a lot more tension than we had been in normally, because as we started driving out of the city, all of a sudden we started doing something which we hadn't been doing before. We started laughing. And all of a sudden, as I was sitting there behind the wheel, all of a sudden I started to sense the tension coming out of my body, and I started relaxing. And we were joking around, and we were having lots of fun. And all of a sudden, the realization came to me, hey, we were having a lot more tension than we normally do. Did it ever feel good to get out of that city for a while? And we started driving along. We didn't see too much traffic. And we were laughing, and it was all in Spanish because Glenda de Zavala, the young pastor's wife that was with us, she didn't know any English. And of course, our family, we were very proficient in Spanish, and that was just very easy to go driving and talking in that language. And we got about 80 or 90 kilometers down the road, and pretty soon we were coming to the area where the mountains start in Ecuador, and they're very tall. And to go from the coast to the mountains, you have to go up really unusual roads that are constantly dropping into the mountain valleys because of landslides. The ground there is very unstable. You have to climb to the 12,000-foot level and then drop down a couple thousand feet into the Central Valley to go to the capital city of Quito. And we were on the flat, and we were getting closer and closer to these mountains. And all of a sudden, we were coming to foothill-type areas. And the roads were becoming quite hilly. And we were chatting along and talking away when I started coming to these high roads. And I crested one of the hills. It was about the 3rd or 4th big hill that I was in. And all of a sudden, I couldn't believe what I saw in front of me. Wham! I slammed on the brakes. Because you know what was in front of me? There's a great big old eucalyptus tree, and it was cut down across the road, and you could tell it had been done deliberately. And all of a sudden, I had a very foreboding sense come to me, and I thought, something's wrong here. And there was about 150 to 200 people in front of that tree, and they were all clustered around 2 cars. So as quick as I could, stopping, without squealing the tires, I stopped, because I didn't want to go there. I thought, something is so wrong. And this tree would sit this high off the ground. And I got out of the car, and I started walking forward a little ways, when all of a sudden, a young child came up to me. And you know what he said? In a really snarky voice, he said, "We're going to kill you." And I thought, you little wart. Because down there, they never talk like that. And you wouldn't believe, I've been away for 10 years, and I've discovered it's not politically correct to spank. But I had the deepest desire, I wanted to spank him. He's only about 5 or 6, and was he ever being arrogant? And he stated, "We're going to kill you." And I started talking to him, and I thought, what is with you? And I was about a few steps from here to the keyboard from the vehicle, and I was talking to him, and he was just really arrogant. And you never, ever, ever do that there. You always start off by a greeting there. They're very polite. Well, all of a sudden, on the side of my eye, there's a fellow running, and he yelled at me. He said, "What are you doing here? Are you crazy?" He said, "Don't you know what's going on ahead?" He said, "At the place just above this, there's a fire going on, and they're torching the cars, and there's lots of bloodshed. They're beating up on people." And in just those instances when I was focusing on this little boy, he was challenging me, and I wasn't watching over there in front of me where these 2 cars and all the people were. As this fellow said this, I looked up, and all of a sudden I realized in shock that those people were on the one side of both those cars, and they were tipping them over to torch them. This fellow kept on running. He's beside me, and he looked at me and says, "Are you crazy?" He said, "And to top it all off, you're a gringo." That means you're a foreigner. And all of a sudden I realized, with a shock, that what was going on here was just very evil and very dangerous. And even though the van was from here to the keyboard, I ran back to it. And you can't imagine the amount of adrenaline all of a sudden that was pumping in my body. And I got in the van, I started it up, and I turned around the corner, and I didn't care who heard me or not. I squealed my tires. And away I went. I wanted out of there. And the national gal that was with us, you should have seen her face. She has a built-in tan. But she was white as a ghost, and she knew more than we did the serious amount of trouble we're in. And the vehicle has a 5-speed transmission, and I know how to drive. I got that van around the corner, and I was going through the gears, and I had that motor racing because I wanted out of there. And I got going. I wasn't long before I was 60 miles an hour and accelerating. I just wanted out of there. And I came to one hill, then I came to another hill. And all of a sudden, I put my brakes on again. And I stopped. And I was absolutely stunned what I saw. Because this hill was a higher vantage point. And I could see in the distance and about, quarter of a mile away to half a mile away. You know what was there? There was another great big old tree, and it was chopped down on the road. And there's people by it. But not only that, I could see in the distance, because I was a high point, and I could see 3 or 4 more of these trees cut down. And people by them in the distance. And I realized with a bang, we're trapped. And I sat there, and I stopped. And the feelings just went over you in waves. And I was just stunned. And all of a sudden I realized I didn't need to be told that something had happened. And we thought we were scot-free, and we were driving out of the city, and we were feeling so good. And you know what was happening? I didn't know it, but at 9 o'clock that day, there was an attempted coup all over the country. And even though the Air Force General and the Army General hated each other, their common bond was that they hated this new president-elect even more. And you know what happened? The Army, the Air Force, and the Marines, and the police all stayed in their barracks that morning. And at 9 o'clock, all over the country, there was an uprising. And all over the country, all the roads were cut off at 9 o'clock. And here we thought we were on our own, and we were feeling so good about driving and relaxing and thinking that we're out of this mess. When you know what was going along? As we were driving, we didn't know it, but we had thousands upon thousands of eyes looking at us. And there, you have lots of banana plantations, but you have lots of trees and lots of big trees, like eucalyptus trees that go 80, 100 feet high. And you have lots of underbrush there because you're right on the equator, and there's jungle in Ecuador. And here we thought we were on our own, but driving all along, there had to have been thousands upon thousands and thousands of people watching us going by. And you know, they were hitting the underbrush, and there you don't build a fence to keep cows in or to mark off your property. You know what you do? All you do is plant a row of a certain type of cactuses, and they go about this high. On the end of the cactus, they have spines that are this long, and even a cow isn't dumb enough to try and get through those. And you know what happened at 9 o'clock? This was all pre-planned. They had pre-selected trees all along this highway, and they had cut them till about almost 2/3 of the way through. And then the people stayed in the underbrush and watched to see who would be driving. And at 9 o'clock, there'd be 2 or 3 people at each tree, at each spot where they're cutting the road off, and 2 or 3 people would work furiously and madly away, and they'd chop the rest of the tree, and it would fall down across the road and block it. And we were sitting there, and I was stopped, and the car motor was still running, but I just come from this place where there's a couple hundred people torching this car in front of me, and the guy said, hey, there's other cars being torched, and people are being out, and there's bloodshed. And I'm sitting in the car, and I could see in the distance 4 or 5 more of these barriers, and I'm a gringo. And I have my wife and my kids in the car, 3 out of them, but 4 children. And Glenda's there just clutching her 8-month-old baby, and Bev was clutching her 6-month-old Daniel. And if you thought my adrenaline was pumping before, now I thought my heart was going to come through my chest because I knew I was trapped, and there was absolutely nowhere to go. When all of a sudden, sort of a strange thing happened. All of a sudden, there was 2 little pickups in front of me with 1 fellow in each one. And they both called out to me, and they said to me, follow me. And I looked at them in shock. I thought, where did you come from? Because the 2 vehicles that were between me and the other barrier were burning by now, and I could see all the way to the barrier behind me, and there had been no vehicles. But as soon as both of them said, follow me, you know what happened? All of a sudden, I just calmed right down. But you know what they did? The one vehicle pulled in front of me, and the one pulled in behind me. And you know what they did? They started driving quite quick back to this back barrier that I could see. And I thought, what are you doing? But all of a sudden, in the underbrush, there was a wee little clearing that was hard to see. And we dove off to the left, and we started racing down this muddy old road. And this was rainy season in Ecuador. And the first little pickup was in front of me, I was in the middle, and the other pickup pulled in behind me. And away we went off on the side road, and we nailed it. We had to go fast. Because all these people knew that this new vehicle, full of gringos, had gone in the road. And of course, we would be a prize catch for people that wanted to make a statement politically or wanted to kidnap us and attempt to get ransom. And we started flying down this road, literally. We were driving fast. When all of a sudden we came to a sharp little valley, and it was very steep. And the first little vehicle went down and up with a little bit of difficulty. I was driving a minivan, which was much bigger than a small little pickup truck.
And it was all I could do to get down and to get up. And I had bigger tires and a bigger motor. And I thought, how's he doing that so easily? But I just made it to the top, and I had to keep on going. And we kept on driving, when all of a sudden the weirdest thing happened. We were driving along, when all of a sudden the first vehicle stopped. And I was sitting higher than him, and I looked over his vehicle. You know what's in front of us? It's called an arroyo in Spanish. It's like a sharp, deep canyon. And it was about from here to the back doors in distance. And you know what was over that canyon, which is basically like a washout area where the water comes flying down at a certain time of the year? You know what was over that thing? 2 tree trunks. It wasn't a bridge, and it didn't have a railing. And I couldn't believe it. This first vehicle, he starts going slowly, and he motioned me behind him to wait. And he gingerly starts going slowly on this tree trunk. And he starts driving on it. And it took quite a while before he got over, but he did. And do you think I wanted to go in that tree trunk? An Aerostar is quite a wide vehicle, and these were small, narrow ones. But the vehicle behind me nudged me. And you know that expression, between a rock and a hard place? I knew I was there. Because any time from behind would be people chasing after us and trying to catch up to us. Because they'd be totally enraged that we escaped from their trap. So I got on this thing, and it really bothered me because I know how to drive, and I knew where my tires were. And I know I had a little bit of tire on one side hanging over the edge of the tree trunk here, and a little bit over here. And I started going really, really slow. And my hands were just clenching that steering wheel. And Bev grabbed Danny, and Glenda grabbed her little boy. And all of a sudden you could cut the air with a knife. And man, it was weird. And it was so tense I couldn't stand the feeling. And I said something I probably shouldn't. You know how sometimes husbands occasionally do that? I did it. I don't do it very often. The only other time I really remember is when our oldest boy was born. He was born in Regina, and Bev went into labor at 11:30, and I stayed up all night rubbing her back. And it was a hard labor, and she was in labor for about 13 or 14 hours. And in the morning, just before Tim was born, I couldn't think of anything else to say, and I was tired too. And she had a particularly bad contraction, and all of a sudden I thought, I know something to encourage her. I said, dear, they say when you have the second one, it's a lot easier. And she didn't say anything to me. She just raised up in the bed, and she just plowed me one in the arm. Well, I was on this little bridge, and everybody was so tight, I thought, I got to say something, and I said, I've got my eyes closed. And the national gal, she just let out a war whoop and just screamed, and inside the car, it just was deafening. And I had to settle her down. And I usually don't make those goof-ups, but I did that day. And I was driving really slowly, and I had my head clenched on the wheel, when all of a sudden my temptation was to stop. What I hadn't realized, what I had seen, when I was stopped before we went across this canyon, I just thought it was these long eucalyptus trees, but you know what it was? It was 2 sets of eucalyptus trees. And in the middle, they were hinged together. And as I was coming closer, all of a sudden I realized in the middle, it was joined together, you know, like you do a log home. And there was about a 6 or 7 inch rise in the middle. And I was going slow and really, really carefully because I knew part of my tires on either side were hanging over the edge. And you know what? I knew that I had to speed up or I wouldn't make it. And you know, I had the biggest desire to stop. But I was committed and I couldn't stop and back up. You ever had that feeling sometimes? And so I stepped on it. But I had to hit it hard enough to make it over that 6 or 7 inch rise without falling off either way. And I hit it and we stayed on. But it seemed like forever before those dumb back tires made it. And we made it on. And I kept on driving. And I tell you, my heart was in my throat. And I just was the weirdest feeling. And I got to the edge and I got off the thing and I had to stop because I just needed to settle down. And I looked in the mirror and the car behind me was coming across and he did the same thing and I watched him like a hawk the whole way and he didn't fall off. But the guy in front of us, he didn't want us to let us stay there very long because people would be coming behind us because of being so upset that we escaped. And we had to go, and we wasted a whole bunch of time there. And I was expecting any time through the underbrush and the undergrowth behind us to have people and old vehicles come flying out after us. And so away we got going again, and it was really muddy because it was rainy season. We kept on going, and we tried to go fast, but you know what happened? All of a sudden the road opened up a little ways, and I couldn't believe what was going on. Because this first little truck, you know where he was heading for? Right in front of us was a lake bed. And he was heading straight for it. And you know what? It was full of water. And I don't swim. I'm a prairie chicken in more ways than one. I've almost drowned a few times, and I hate water above here. I just hate it. And he started going right into the lake. And I stopped. There was no way I was going in that lake. Yeah, it was the dumbest thing. Your mind didn't want to do that. And I stopped. And this little truck was going in front of me, and he slowed down. And you could see the ground under the water for a ways, but then it was all sparkling and blue, and you couldn't. And the truck behind me, you know what he did? He came up behind me, and he nudged me. And you know what? I had to keep on going because there's people coming after us, trying as hard as they could do to catch up to us. And so as much as I hated to do it, I started driving in that crazy lake. And you know what we did? We were in that lake bed for over an hour and a half. And you couldn't drive straight across because you know why? It was too deep. And this truck in front of us, you're just going to have to try and understand this. It was like being in a maze. And even though you couldn't see underneath the surface, we'd be driving over here, and then we'd go over here, and then we'd make a weird turn, and then we'd go over here, and it was the weirdest thing. It was the weirdest way we drove in that lake. And we were doing a turn here, and then back here, and every so often, all of a sudden, the vehicle would tip this way a little bit, or would tip this way. And the water at times was right on the edge of the hood, the sloping hood of the Aerostar. And there was water coming in the footwells, and my hands were clenching that steering wheel, and I was in first gear. And it hurt my eyes to drive there. It was in the middle of the day, and the sun was shining bright. And the equator looked like I was looking at a sea of diamonds, and I had very gray glasses, and the windshield of the van was tinted. But we had a bow wave going, and I thought, how is this motor staying to work? But nobody could talk because it was quiet as could be in that car, and we were going ever so slowly, and ever so often a slow motion move, the thing would tip a little bit this way or this way, and we kept on going. And Bev says it was between an hour and a half or 2 hours, and we were in there, and I hated every moment of it. And nobody could speak a word, and my hands just gripped the steering wheel. All of a sudden, my little girl, she just shrieked. All of a sudden, she bellowed out, she says, "No más agua, Papi!" She just screamed her head off. And she was only 3 at that age, but it means no more water, Daddy. And she screamed it in Spanish. She just lost it. And Bev had to settle her down. And we kept on going, and it seemed to take absolutely forever in this lake doing these weird patterns because for some reason, this guy in front knew where to drive. And I was trying to put this together. I thought, what is going on here? And it was just like a slow motion drama. It was a slow motion accident. I thought, you just couldn't leave it. When all of a sudden, you know what he did? He started angling towards the shore to the other side. And as dumb as it may sound, all of a sudden I got even more upset because I thought, how am I going to climb up out of this lake and get out of it? And it took a while to get over there. I thought, how am I going to have the traction? But the first vehicle got out and he started climbing out. And you know what? We did too. And we started climbing out. And I looked behind us, and the other small vehicle was starting to climb out. And I had a problem, because the first vehicle was starting to pull away from me. But I had been driving for an hour and a half to 2 hours in this lake, and I was in first gear. And you know what I couldn't do? I couldn't shift the gears, because I couldn't get my hands off the steering wheel. And they were just gripped on there as tight as can be. And I went to shift, and I stepped on the gas, and I was going to shift, but my hand wouldn't come on. And I slowed down quite a bit, because I couldn't shift. And the truck in front of me was starting to pull away, and I started breathing a little bit more, or deeper, and I looked at my wife, and I looked back where I was driving, and I looked at my wife, and I looked behind me. And I needed to shift, but I couldn't talk because I was so overwhelmed with just what had happened. And I looked ahead of me, and you know what? I just reacted, and my mouth dropped open, because the vehicle in front of me had totally disappeared. And Bev saw it too, and I whipped my head back to look at this one that I just looked at.
And guess where that one was? It was totally gone. And just the flooding over my being came the awareness that those weren't just regular old people I'd been with. And if you have trouble believing in angels, read about in Hebrews chapter 1, because they are there. The Bible says to look after those that God loves and that they're part of His family. And all of a sudden, from what we had come through with hours by being on the road and that weird bridge and in the lake, they were there and then they were gone. And there was nowhere for them to escape without us seeing them. And we were on their own. And we looked at each other, and just all of a sudden, nobody had to be told who those people were. And I was still in first gear because I couldn't get my hand off the steering wheel, but I had to get it off, and I started trying to move my fingers. And it took a while, but I got them off. And it started shifting the gears, and away we were. And we were all on our own. And I didn't have a clue where we were. But I could see the mountains in the distance, and so I just started driving. And do you know what we encountered in the next 2 hours? We went over, around, or pushed through a good 40 or 50 more barriers in the next 2 hours. But because so much time had lapsed between 9 o'clock and the time we were there, everybody had left these barriers where the roads were cut off, except we encountered one lady. And when she saw us, she just grimaced and yelled, and she shrieked, and she wanted us to stop, and she shook her fist at us, and there's no way I was stopping. But you know, we had another problem. And the trees there weren't that big, so some of them I could push through, but I had to be real careful because some of them were still burning. And I had to go that way, and I didn't want the gas tank to ignite. So sometimes we were going through trees and branches, we went off-road, sometimes we pushed them over. And our car, because all the mud that was on it from climbing out of that lake was a mess, all of a sudden now we had little bits of branches and twigs and stuff on it. And for 2 hours we started driving that way, but our other problem was that in Ecuador, when they want to close the roads down, you know what they do? They spike them. And they get the cheapest spikes you can get that don't have heads on. They pound them into the roads. Because the tire for my car 5 years ago for that van was over $200 each. And they can't afford that, and neither could I. And for 2.5 hours, you know what I was driving on? Spiked roads. And I could see them every so often, the sun glinting off, not bright new metal, but old metal, but they'd be glinting. And that's what we were driving on. And to complicate matters, I didn't say anything more to my wife. But 2 days beforehand, one of my colleagues went out driving. He thought he had to go somewhere, and he ran on a spiked road in Guayaquil, and he got a flat. And the way the Lord organized it, he found somebody with a phone that worked, and he got through to my phone. A miracle of miracles, his line got through, which was absolutely amazing. He said, "Cal, you've got to help me. I'm at such and such a place, and I got a flat tire, and my jack is broken, and I need you to come and help me. Otherwise, anytime somebody come along, they'll burn my vehicles." You know what I did? After being trapped in the house for 4 days in Guayaquil, I went out and helped him, and I found him. And I got there without any problem because I took a back way. And I put my jack, a scissors jack, under his great big Chevrolet van, and we changed his tire, but where he was parked, as we were letting the jack down, all of a sudden his van shifted. And when it shifted, it just totally bent my jack, and I didn't have a jack that worked. And because the previous week our allowance was supposed to come, but it hadn't got there because the banks were closed and the post office wasn't working, I didn't have next to any money. I started off on the way to Quito with about $7 or $6 in my pocket. And I didn't have a jack. And we drove for over 2 hours on spiked roads and pushed over these barriers or went around them when we could, or I moved stuff out of the way. And all of a sudden we were almost at the mountains when two things happened. The road had a great big curve in it. And you know what happened? Parked kitty across the highway, a smaller truck, and a tree that was cut down, and that tree was in the mud between the small truck and a house. And in front of that barrier, there had to be over 200 people standing there and milling around. And I thought, oh no. And I didn't want to go to that town, so I started slowing down. You know what happened when I slowed down? I heard air coming out of one of my tires. And my first reaction was, Lord, after being on spiked road for 2 hours, why in the world am I getting a flat now for? But I knew that I didn't have a jack to change it, and I knew that unless I went to this town for help, I'd be stranded. So I picked up the speed, and I pulled up to that barrier, and as I pulled up to that barrier and all sorts of people started milling around me, I could feel the truck go right down onto the rim of the tire at the back on the left-hand side. I got out of the truck, and I said, and keep the doors locked, and I got out, and all of a sudden I had a bunch of people screaming at me, and they said, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here?" And they were all screaming at once, and they were all crowding around me.
And they said, where did you come from? And I said, I came from Guayaquil. And that just made them mad and upset. And they all started screaming. They said, mentiroso, mentiroso, liar, liar. And all of a sudden I was so bewildered. I thought, why are you people so angry at me? And I stopped talking. It was a really ugly sound. And then there seemed to be 2 or 3 ringleaders. And you know what? Some of them had pistols and others of them had knives in their hands. And I thought, wow, what have I got myself into? And they said, don't you move, you stay here. And the ringleaders went off to the side and started talking to me. And they said, you stay here and don't you move. So I stayed there. And all these people around me, and they were glaring at me. When all of a sudden a fellow sidled up to me and he whispered, he actually hissed on my ear. He said, for heaven's sakes, keep your mouth shut. He said, don't you know where you are? And I said, no, I don't. He said, you're in the center of communist activity there. Here. And this is what he said. He said, anybody that attempts to go through here, they'll kill you. And I couldn't believe what he had said. And it just went in like daggers. And he said, for heaven's sakes, keep your mouth shut. And so I did, and he barely got away, and he showed me his car was sitting there. He'd been there 2 days, he said, and it was behind a whole bunch of people. And the ringleaders came back, and they said, where did you come from after all? Don't you lie to us this time. And I said, listen, I came from Guayaquil. I said, I did, and I said, the Lord has looked after us in the most incredible way. And they all started getting mad at me again. But then they left because they weren't sure what to do, and they weren't sure whether to believe me or not. And so they walked away again, and so I was left with a bunch of people milling around at me, looking at me, but not saying anything. So after a while, I thought, hey, I'm going to use this chance to go borrow this other guy's jack that warned me. And I went over to him, and I found him. I said, would you let me borrow your gato? And gato in Spanish means jack, and it also means cat. It can mean a few things. And he said, what do you need my gato for, my jack? I said, well, mine is broken. He said, you've got a new car. I said, I broke mine 2 days ago. And so reluctantly, he gave me his jack. I went to the back of the van, and I took out the spare tire, and I looked at it. And all of a sudden, I thought, oh, no. Because what I had forgotten about, you know what was in the back of the minivan? My spare tire. But you know what kind of a spare tire it was? It looked like a bicycle tire. It's one of these dumb things that you can only drive 40 miles on. And it was a skinny, shrimpy little thing, and I just looked at that just sick. I thought, I can't drive in the mountains with that. But I got it on the car, and it looked so stupid because the back of the van was sunk way down. And here was this skinny little tire. And I went back and handed this jack back. And all of a sudden, I barely gotten back to the car, and I was going to go in the car, when all of a sudden everybody pressed around me, and the ringleaders came back. And they said to me, you tell us the truth now, or you're in deep trouble. And they started saying to me, where did you come from? And you know what happened? I just got some real boldness in the Lord. And I said, listen, you listen to me. And they looked at me startled at my tone of voice. I said, I did come from Guayaquil, and they started yelling something, but I talked them down. I said, I am somebody here that loves you. I'm not part of the political thing. I'm here to serve you. I'm here to help you. I said, I have nothing to do with this. I said, I'm a missionary. And I said, I love you people. I said, I'm on my way to Quito to see my boy. And I said, the Lord has brought us through the most incredible things to get us this far. But I said, I have to go to Quito because my son's going to be worried about me. And he's going to be terrified with what's going on. And you know what happened? All of a sudden, they just got enraged again. They said, you're not going anywhere. And they all started screaming this. Well, all of a sudden, the Lord started speaking to me even louder on the inside. And you know what he said to me? He said, Cal, you are in deep danger. And I sort of knew that, but I didn't know how bad. But this is what he said. You have to get out of here now. And so all of a sudden, I just had the boldness in the Lord. And I firmly believe what it says in Psalms. If you have 1,000 by your side or 10,000 in front of you, if God's in it, nothing will happen to you. And so you know what I did? I walked in front of the car. And all of a sudden, everybody started looking at me. And I went off to the side, and I went off into the mud, and I started walking. And the Lord said, walk really slowly. And I walked over to the tree. And I used to be a weightlifter. It's only since my thyroid quit working that I gained weight. But I went down there, and I looked to that tree trunk, and I bent down, and I used my legs to get my back straight. And the trunk was like about this, but it was about 20 feet long, and I started lifting it. And because all the branches and stuff was hard to move, and I lifted it really, really slowly. And all of a sudden, everybody was looking at me and glaring at me something fierce. And they wanted me to, if looks could kill, I was a dead man. And I didn't like looking at them. I couldn't believe how they're looking at me. And I started moving this tree slowly when all of a sudden I slipped in the mud and I fell, and the tree fell on me. And I couldn't move. Any way I tried, I couldn't get that tree off me. And I sat there in the mud, on the ground. I wasn't sitting, I was splayed all over the ground with this tree trunk on me. And they just looked at me and they're angry. And all of a sudden a fellow shuffled over and came to me, and he made a half-hearted attempt to pick it up, and he couldn't do it, but with his little bit and how I braced myself, I got it off, and I was covered with mud on my back. And I bent down, and all of a sudden, the looks were just hideous. And I picked up the tree and started moving it. But I couldn't stand what I was looking at these people. They had hatred in their eyes. So as I was moving it, I tried to look away. And I looked behind me, and what I hadn't realized, on the other side of this barrier, there had to be 80 or 90 more people. And they were looking at me in the same way. And oh, man, was that ever ugly. But I got the tree out of the way, and I walked slowly. You know what I had to do? I had to walk around people. They wouldn't get out of the way, and sometimes they'd jab me sort of with their shoulder. And I walked to the truck. And I started, and I backed up, and people looked at me like they couldn't believe what I was doing, that I'd have the audacity to do that. And I backed up, and I went off the road. And I went in the mud. And I almost got stuck, and I started the wheels going like crazy when all hell broke loose. They all started screaming, kill him and burn his truck, and just some of the grossest stuff like you wouldn't believe. And they were waving their hands, and they all went berserk. And it was just the most awfulest thing. And the faster I tried to go, the more racket the wheels made, but I almost lost traction, got stuck, and they just went wild. And I think I heard everything that people had said, and it seemed like I was in there for an eternity. And in the car, they were ducking down, and they were holding the kids, and it just was the awfulest thing to be in. But the weirdest thing was happening. Even though they were screaming, yelling all this trash and this hellishness, they weren't moving, and it was the weirdest thing. And all of a sudden, I tried to look away from it, but where could you look? And I didn't want to hit anybody. And I had the thing just flying, the racket it was making, but they couldn't move. It was like they were frozen in place, and it was the weirdest sensation. And all of a sudden, ooh, I hit a dry spot underneath. And the car didn't go ahead. You know what it did? It sort of leapt in the air. That's how I had those tires going. And it's a wonder I didn't wreck the rear end. But the car sort of launched, and then it sort of settled down. And it squealed a bit because I hit dry dirt, and I had so much torque going in the back end. And as soon as I did that, I was on dry ground. I mean, the car just launched ahead. All of a sudden, everybody could move at me, and they all came flying at me. But I went flying down that road, and they were screaming. It was just bloody murder what was coming out of them. And again, my heart was just pounding like a jackhammer. And I went flying down that road, and the road took a curve, and all of a sudden the Lord said to me, you can't go up that mountain with that tire in the car. He said, as clear as day. And I got around the curve, and I could see in the distance behind, well over half a mile behind, the people stopped running. And we're talking 120 degree Fahrenheit, so they don't run too far in that weather. Got around that curve, and what did I see? A sign that said vulcanización. That means tire fix-it shop in Spanish. And I went to this dumpy little house, and there was a man standing there. I couldn't believe he was there, and I said, I need a tire fix. Would you do it for me? And after 5 days of riding, I was surprised to find somebody there, but I was even more surprised to find somebody to help me. He said, yes, I will. So we got the tire out of the back, and he looked at it, and he said, I'm sorry, I can't fix this. And I said, what do you mean you can't? He says, look at how the hole is. He said, you're going to have to get a camera. And camera in Spanish means camera like you take pictures with. It also means tire tube. And I said, a camera. I said, where can you get a tire tube here? Everything's shut down, and where can you get a tire tube that will fit my van tire? He said, don't worry, I have a friend. I said, but where? And I wasn't under control, but the emotion was coming out like, I couldn't believe this was happening. He said, don't worry, we'll go in my car. And you know what he had? He had an old French Citroën that they still built in World War II, and it's a 2-cylinder car, and it's a funny-looking thing. He said, let's go find him. And he was willing to take me. I couldn't believe this guy. And I got in the car, and I'm heavy, and when I got in, the whole car sank. And it was an old car, and the floorboards, you know what? You could see most of the ground outside because they're rotted through. And it was the weirdest car to get into. I didn't know if... it was weird. And we got in this car, and it smoked like a stack. And away we went down more to the town, and we found this place, and it was all locked up. It all had these steel doors on the front. But he went around the back, and sure enough, the guy was there. And do you know how many tire tubes he had? Take a guess how many tire tubes he had that would fit in my car. He had one. And you know how much it cost? When I paid for that thing, you know the change I got back? It was the equivalent of 1 1/3 Canadian cents. And that's all I had on me. And he gave me the change, which even in Ecuador is a big joke, because they're wee little tiny things. Now they use them for electrical things and stuff. They don't use them for money. And I'm just sitting there holding the tire tube. I couldn't believe how much this thing's cost. And he had one. We went back to the place, and I wasn't worried because I had some big denomination coins in there. And I could pay the man for fixing my tire. He got it on. And I started saying thank you. And all of a sudden, a fellow was walking by, a big guy that was sweating like a dog. And all of a sudden, he shrieked, and he looked at me, and he was walking by. And here it was one of those fellows that was at that barrier that had been running after us. All he had done now was started walking towards the middle of town. And he just went wild. He said, "What are you doing helping that gringo for?" And you know this guy at the tire fixer place said, "Because I want to." And I'm sitting there totally stunned. "You want to? How come?" And I thanked him. I could have hugged him. I had to go because if there's one guy, there'd be another guy. And so I got in the car and I raced away down the center of town, and I thought I'm home free. And the mountains were right there. It was right at the edge of the mountains, and you could see the road start sliding up. And I stepped on the gas. I just wanted out of there. And I went around the corner, and I did have to slam my brakes on this time and slam on hard, and the car started slowing around because the road was narrow there. But you know what's in front of me? About 2 truckloads of dirt and some burning trees and tires and about 15 people. And that's all they needed at that barrier because the road was so narrow there. And I slammed the brakes on, and the car slewed around just a little bit, and I stopped almost to where the stuff was burning. And I got out of the car, and you know what they said to me? They said, "What are you doing here?" And they were really agitated and upset. And they said, "Where did you come from?" And I said, "I came from Guayaquil." They said, "You liar." And they all said it once, and I'm not used to being called a liar. I said, "I did." I said, "The Lord looked after us." They said, "You couldn't have got through this town." And so they went, and they said, "Don't you move." And they went down to my wife and the other gal, and they talked to them. But instead of coming back angry, you know what they came back? Totally flustered. And this is what they said: "We don't understand what's happening here." And then they repeated what this guy in this other car had said at the last barrier. They said, "If anybody tries to get through here, we have said we'll kill him. And we don't understand how you got through town." And so then this is what they said to me. They said, "We'll let you go through, but only on one condition. You have to clear this barrier yourself." And I thought, "Oh yeah, sure." But I didn't say anything negative to them. They said, "If we help you, they might even kill us." But they didn't want to stop us. They were so conscious of the fact something supernatural was going on. They just were really weird, and they acted really flustered. So I didn't need any more encouragement. I whipped off my shirt. I grabbed a part of a car door, and I grabbed a piece of wood. And there's no way in the wide world I could clear out 2 dump truck loads of sand and dirt. But I made a pathway, and I sort of built a ramp. I had to be real careful where I walked because there was a lot of trees and stuff that were still burning, and it was hot. And I tried to clear as much as I could and to make a semblance of a way where I could go. And then I got back to the truck, and my wife handed me a yellow towel, and I wiped my hands and arms off it with it. And it was black because of the tire from burning car tires, the tar. She never did get it clean. And I backed the truck up, and I had to hit it hard and fast. And I had to get over fast because there was stuff that was burning there. And I didn't want the gas tank to ignite. And I made them get out of the car and walk around the barrier because I didn't know if it was going to ignite or not. And I hit it hard and made a horrendous sound, and I got over the thing. And you wouldn't believe the noise. And while they filed back into the car, I had to go under the car because there was a lot of wire from burnt-out tire carcasses that wrapped around my rear axle and the wheel. And I got that out, and the lady said to me, she said, "Would you mind if I went up the mountain with you?" And do you think I wanted to be a taxi at that moment? I just didn't. But I didn't want to make them upset, and they let me go through, so I took her. And for the next 6 kilometers, she blessed us on the way up the mountain, then she left. And I won't spend any more time on this part of this testimony, but you know what we did for the next 7 hours? We drove up the mountain, never met one more car, nor one more person. But at that barrier, I realized we had another problem. We had been driving for about over 6.5 hours now. Guess what my problem was? Guess what it was? Gas. I had no money left to buy gas. There was no place to sell it there, and all the ones that were there were closed. I would have had to backtrack. You know what we did for 7 hours? We drove out up that mountain without a lick of gas in that gas tank. And that's what we did. And we never met a person. We got to the top of that mountain when the Lord put some thoughts in my mind. And this is what I said. I said, the Lord has called a meeting. Because we got to the crest of that mountain, we started dropping down. And you know what was in front of us? A small town about 1,000 feet below. And the road went right through it. And we were above the tree line there. And we stuck out like a sore thumb because the car was white. At least it was still white on the top. The sides were covered with mud from the lake, and we had tree branches and leaves and everything sticking out everywhere. But there was a town with dumpy housing and a big Catholic church and a plaza in front of it. And you know what was in the plaza? About 600 men with ponchos. And all of a sudden I had this terrible foreboding. But I also said, this is what I said, the Lord has called a meeting. And I went down the mountain, and all of a sudden I sensed danger, and I knew I had to get out of there. And I stepped on the gas pedal. There was no gas there, but the car still worked as if there was gas. And I started flying down the mountain. I knew I had to get through that town. And just at the entrance of the town, there was about 6 or 7 young men there sitting there. And when they heard the sound of the car, and I had the motor racing, they jumped up and they started running towards me, and they wanted me to stop. And I knew I couldn't stop. And I swerved to the left, and I had the car rocking just a bit, but I got through them. And I got through them, and I went really fast. I had such a sense of evil and foreboding there. And I went around a great big curve of about 1.5 kilometers, and then the road started dropping again. And just as it started dropping, I caught some movement through my rearview mirror, and I looked around, and there was a great big Toyota Land Cruiser, the $50,000 kind. And it was coming right off the side of the mountain. There was one man in it. And this one man, he was doing 3 things at once. He was honking the horn. He was pulling in and out his light switch, and he was waving his arms, and I don't know how he did it all at once. And he was agitated, and he came behind me, and I didn't want to stop, but he had a great big motor in it, and he caught up to me, and I kept going. I wasn't going to stop for him. So I thought for a bit, and we were racing along, and I thought, well, finally, this guy, he's one guy, so he can't hurt me, so I stopped. And shortly after he got out of his car and started walking to me, another truck came along off the side of the mountain, a dumpy little truck with an older man in it, very poorly dressed, and he came up near us, and he stopped, and he listened to us. And this man got out of the truck, and I went up to him, and he didn't greet me, which you always do in a Latin country. He says to me, "Where did you come from?" And you know, I'd heard that question just one too many times. And I started getting a little upset. I said, "What do you mean, where did I come from?" I said, "You saw me where I came from." He said, "You did not?" I said, "I did so." He said, "You did not?" I said, "I did so." And I started getting a little irritated. He said, "You did not," 3 or 4 more times. And I said, "I did so," about 3 or 4 more times. And I thought, this is silly. This is like 3-year-olds arguing over a car. And I said, "Listen," I said, "I came from there." Then all of a sudden the Lord settled me down because I was starting to get irritated. My emotions had gone up and down so many times that day. And the Lord gave me a song, and this is the words of the song. It's by the Imperials. It's an old song. It's 20 years old. "He didn't bring you this far to leave you. He didn't lift you up to let you down." And all of a sudden my spirit was quieted. And I said to the guy, I said, "Listen," I said, "it doesn't matter whether you believe me or not. You know I came from there." But I said, "The Lord Jesus Christ has looked after me today in the most incredible ways." And I got through all the way from Guayaquil, and he just looked at me and his eyes bugged out. He started shaking his head. "I did." I said, "I've been through a lake today. I've been through different places where people didn't want to let me through. I've been on spiked roads." I said, "And the Lord has looked after me in the most incredible ways." And he said, "How can that be?" He said, "This town here," he said, "that's the bus drivers union, and it's the worst one here." And they also said, he didn't say also, but this is what went to my mind. He said, "If anybody even tries to come through here, they'll kill you." He was saying that when all of a sudden something else weird happened. This was a weird day. All of a sudden, along the side of the road, just like a bunch of lemmings, you know what came under the underbrush because we were getting back into the tree area? All of a sudden, there was a bunch of women, instead of red ponchos, the gray ones. And they were on the side of the hill up here, running uphill. They were on the road, and they were on the side of the hill, the mountain on the downside. And they were all running, and they were all terrified, and they were running in slow motion. And they were coming out like lemmings from all over the place. And it looked weird. I thought, what is going on? And it not only looked weird to me, it looked weird to him. And all of a sudden, our attention was distracted with these women. What's going on here? And so he said to them, he yelled out, "What's the matter with you crazy women?" And as they got closer, it was like they were in a trance, and they were terrified. And even though they were making a lot of effort, it was up high in the elevation, they weren't going very fast. And it was freaky. It was like a slow-motion disaster. And so he screamed at one. He said, "What's the matter with you, lady?" And she wouldn't respond to him. It's like he didn't exist. And he was a tall man. He took some strides, and he went over to her. You know what he did? He said, "What's the matter with you, lady?" And he swore at her. She still didn't respond, so he grabbed her by the scruff of the neck. And, "What's the matter with you, lady?" And he shook her, and she still didn't respond. And she looked away, and it was like she was in a trance. So he cuffed her one on the side of her head. And it was like she snapped out of it. And she's, in a blurred speech, she says, "What's the matter?" she said. "They're fighting down below." She said, "They're killing people. There's torching big trucks, and there's a horrible mess down below." And she went wild, as she said, and her eyes went wide. It looked like she was just going to go crazy. And to get her to speak, this taller man had to literally hold her up as she was speaking. And as she was speaking, all of a sudden I heard the sound of a buzzsaw. You know what they were doing in the distance? They were cutting down trees. And this guy looked at her, and then he looked at me, and instead of saying thank you or anything else, he let her go, and he dropped her, and she almost fell to the ground. And then she kept on running. It's like we weren't there. And he turned around at me, he says, I've got to go. I said, thanks a lot. I said, well, what? I said, where can I go? He said, sir, do you know what kind of trouble you were in? I said, I've been in trouble all day. And I said, the Lord has looked after me. He said, in just a short while, you're going to have people from that town that are so mad that you got through. They're going to be coming here any time, and I've got to go. And then this is what he said. He said, I cannot help you because I own a big hacienda and land here, and if I help you, they'll kill me. And I thought inside, well, thanks a lot. He said, I'm sorry, you're on your own. And he says, you can't go ahead, you can't go behind. It's only a matter of time when they get you. And I said, they aren't going to get me. I said, how do you get off this mountain? He said, there is no way. I said, there is so. The Lord didn't bring me this far to let me go. He said, how do you get off this? I said again, how do you get off this mountain? He said, there is no way. I said, how do you get off this mountain? And he started getting irritated with me, and all of a sudden he slowed down. And he said, there isn't. And then all of a sudden he blurted out, he says, there's a path here that we used to use for llamas and cattle. And it's just a path that goes off the side of the mountain, but you don't even use it anymore. I said, good, where is it? He said, you can't use that. You're local, you're crazy. I said, you've told me I'm in danger, I have to find it, where is it? And he said, he explained it to me, he said, I've got to go. And he was really starting to get terrified, he wanted to get out of there, because he knew people were after me, and he left, and I started walking to my car. And then this guy that was in the little car, this poorly dressed man, he comes up to me, and he holds my door, and he wouldn't let me in. I said, excuse me, I've got to go. He says, do you know who you were talking to? I said, no, I haven't got a clue who I was talking to. Excuse me, I have to go. And he wouldn't get out of my way. He said, do you know who you're talking to? I said, no. And then he said, do you know who you're talking to? And I thought, oh, man, what's going on here? I really did. He said, I said, no. And then he looked at me and said, you really don't know, do you? I said, no, I don't. You know, he told me who I'd been talking to? The ex-president of Ecuador. Not the immediate previous one, but one before that. And that's who the Lord had sent to guide me. And then he quickly got in his vehicle, I went in mine, and I had to backtrack, and I raced back because I knew they'd be coming at me any time. And after 2 tries, I found it, but before we went down it, I said to Beth, you pray. And she prayed, and I couldn't close my eyes. All I could do was look at the gas gauge. And I wish I would have looked at my watch, because this is what Beth prayed. She said, dear Lord, please get us off this mountain before darkness falls. Because at the equator, there's next to no twilight. There's just a couple minutes, and it's black. And we were going off a mountain, no lights, no nothing, off a mountain, literally. And I wish I would have looked at my clock. But we drove for almost another hour, and we went off the mountain. It wasn't easy, it wasn't hard, but it wasn't easy. And we did it. And we came to a town. And we got to the town, it got black as pitch as we got even to the first house. We started driving to the town, and the Lord said to me, buy gas. And I started saying inside, buy gas? What do we need gas now for? And I didn't mean it disrespectfully, but I was so perplexed what was going on. And I said, I don't even have any money. He said, ask Glenda. So I asked Glenda. I turned around. I said, do you have any money? And she looked at me flustered. She said, what do you need money for? I said, well, I'd like to put some gas in. Then all of a sudden she put her hand to her face and she looked at me. She knew we'd needed gas hours and hours and hours and hours before. And she couldn't talk out of that. She fished out a couple of 1,000 sucre bills, a few dollars worth, and we found a gas station. It was all closed and locked up. And nobody was there. I said, Lord, why do I need gas for? And after honking for 4 or 5 minutes, all of a sudden somebody comes peering around the edge of the gas station looking like this. And you know what? He came up to me and the first thing he said was, where did you come from? And I sort of didn't like hearing that, but I said, you're not going to believe me anyway. But I said, I did come from Guayaquil. You know what he did? He said, liar, right away. And they don't do that. He just couldn't believe it happened. But then instead of looking at me, you know what he did? He walked around the car. I'm almost done. It'll take me 2 more minutes. He walked around the car and he ignored me. And he went all the way around. Then he went all the way around again. And I started focusing on the car. And the car was black. I had tree branches. I had leaves sticking underneath the windshield wipers, coming out of the grill, where you open the thing up to put the gas in, there was stuff sticking up. And you never saw such a looking car in your life. And this is what he said to me. He came around after the second trip around the thing. He said, you really did come from Guayaquil. And he was amazed. And then this is what he said. Do you know what's happened today? He said, at 9 o'clock, this country was shut down. And I said, yeah, I know. But I said, the Lord has brought me here, and I explained it a little bit to him. And he drank it in like a man who's really thirsty. And he just took it all, and he agreed with every little thing. And the Lord wanted me to have gas in the car. You know why? Not because I needed it, because he wanted me to testify to this man. We put gas in the car and started driving. It took another an hour and a half. And we went on roads, trees were on the roads, there was smashed glass, there was tree trunks, there was rocks. But we made it home. And at around 1:30 a.m., we pulled into the Alliance Academy. And there's big gates there and guards and everything. That's the way life is in Ecuador. And I came to the gate, and all of a sudden the guy looked, and he had been sort of dozing a little bit. And he saw me, and he looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. Then he raced out and opened the door because everybody had been praying that morning because they knew we had left at around 8 o'clock that morning, many, many hours ago, about 15 hours ago. And we drove up to the dorm where the school is, and the lights were still on, and Tim's dorm parents, the Ekdals, came racing downstairs, and they looked at us like they'd seen a ghost, and Tim came down shortly after, and they woke him up. And you wouldn't believe how good it was to see my boy. I mean, had a big hug, and he didn't say anything in front of him, but he knew the danger that was there. And then you know what we did? After a while, and we didn't want to say anything in front of Tim, the guy just looked at us with his eyes open, like, how did you get through? And then we laid down, and we went to bed. But just before I went in, he got me to the side. He said, don't talk now, but he said, I need to tell you one thing. He said, it's been closed down here for days. And he said, this morning somebody thought they had a problem. And you know what they did? They took their big Suburban, and they got 4 blocks away from the academy. And they ran into Molotov cocktails and demonstrators and bricks and rocks. And they bricked out all of his windows and took them all out. And one of the bricks went through the windshield and hit his wife, and she needed about 14 stitches to close her forehead up. And it was all they could do to race and to get on sidewalks and everything else to get back into the safety of the dorm. And he said, you got on the way from Guayaquil? And I said, we did. And then we went and laid down in bed, and I was exhausted. I've never been so tired in my life. But you know what? I stayed awake for about 4 hours thinking, Jesus, you looked after me. And you saved my family. And you sent angels. You sent the ex-president of the country. And all I could do in that bed, I put my hands up. I just praised him and thanked him for a good old 4 or 5 hours. I said, you did it just for me. You love me that much. And I worshiped him like you wouldn't believe. At about 6 or 7 in the morning, I dropped off to sleep, and I woke up because the sun was so bright. It was about 11 or 12. And we got up the next morning, and you know what? We went outside, and people were looking at the van. And they were walking around it. And it was covered, and people had been talking about it. And it had goop on it this thick. And I was worried that I'd wrecked the Lord's van. I said, Lord, I really schmucked your car, because I was really grateful for people who had given it to us. I didn't have the money to have it. So later on the day, we cleaned it, and there was not one scratch on it. I went to do something else, and I opened up the hood, and guess how much mud was slathered all over everywhere in the interior. I don't know how it ran. But the day before, what should have taken 6 hours took 15. But the Lord brought us through in the most incredible, remarkable, godly, and powerful way. And praise be his name.